As I just think about mission and our theme today, I just remember arriving in Russia for one of the first times. I was in St. Petersburg, and I was just with a group of young people. I was just looking out the window. It was grey, and it was just the start of the winter. And I thought, man, this is the front line of mission. This is where communism reigned. And we're talking about the front line of mission, and someone goes, no, this isn't the front line. It's out in Siberia. They do it much harder out there. Those pastors have been in prison camps. A few months later, I went out to Siberia, thinking, finally, I've arrived at the front line of mission. And someone goes, oh, no, minus 40 degrees in winter. In Yakutsk, northern Siberia, it's minus 60. They're doing it so tough out there. That's the front line of mission. I thought, front line of mission is everywhere where I'm not. And I just began to think over the years, where is this front line of mission? And I think that the front line of mission is in our hearts. And as you examine your heart, as I examine my own, there is always this choice of whether we get involved or not in this great commission to go and to respond to God's command. The heart is the place where we decide whether we get involved and whether or not we obey. And the greatest distance that most of us will travel in mission is from our heads to our hearts, from knowing to doing, moving from knowing to obeying, from charity to costly involvement, from slacktivism to incarnational ministry, where we actually get involved and we give not only finance but our time, and we sacrifice part of our life. And so today's theme is about alignment. What are we aligned with in life? And we'll look at the story of Esther, because it's an amazing story about how Esther aligned herself with God's people and aligned herself with God's purposes. And her decision to get involved brought about a reversal of fortune for her people. And I think today many of us are looking for reversals in certain situations in our lives, in our family, in our communities, and also elsewhere around the world. As I look at the evil just happening in Israel and Gaza, as I look at Russia and Ukraine, I'm just reminded of Solzhenitsyn, who said, we all look for evil somewhere else. And he says, you only have to examine your own heart, and you will see that the line of good and evil runs down the center of each one of us. Each one of us is capable of so much good, but also so much evil. And just thinking about Russia again, reminded of the story of Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill. They were meeting in Yalta in 1945 to carve up Europe. And Roosevelt made a tribute to Stalin, and it just did it reluctantly. And then Churchill felt under pressure and proposed a toast because he wasn't sure what to say. And he says, to Premier Stalin, whose conduct of foreign policy manifests a desire for peace. And then he whispered, a piece of Poland, a piece of Czechoslovakia, a piece of Romania. And I just think about the world and how much has changed since World War II. We now have Putin wanting peace, a piece of Ukraine, but there are also many new opportunities. We heard from Sally about Mozambique. Just looking at statistics around the world today, 55% of the world now live in major cities. Many of the world's unreached now live in the mega cities of the world. Just reading the Lausanne report. If you're into mission and you want to know about the state of the world today and how much of the work of the Great Commission is left, just look up the Lausanne report. It's just come out in the last few weeks, but just a fascinating report of what is left to do, how many people still remain unreached. But there are also amazing stories and videos of what God is doing. And we also see from that report just amazing things happening in India, but also in Africa, but also in the Arab world. Just people movements, people coming to Christ. And it's not part of some mission strategy, absolute chaos, but just people responding to a move of God in their place. But I just want to turn back to the story of Esther and just talk about alignment. You're going to have an AGM after this meeting. And I just wonder, are you going to align yourself with what God has placed on people's hearts for this coming year? What role will you play, whether you feel like it or not? And I just look at my life and I look at my alignment. So much of just me stepping into mission came from just a sense of dread, going, oh, why do I want to do this? I'll just do 2 years in mission, then I'll just go back to my job as a quantity surveyor. But of course, I will just give a little bit of money to mission. And so somehow through God's grace, I align myself with mission. And for the last 32 years, I've just been working. And so back to the story of Esther. It's a fascinating story of an orphan girl who rises to prominence in Persia. She was powerless, but became powerful. And the story, because we know this story from Sunday school, it concludes with Esther and her older cousin writing laws for the Persian Empire. And it's a book of reversals. And just in worship, we're just singing about some of those songs, and the words were just talking about reversal, things being changed in our lives. And the Jews read this story of Esther at the festival of Purim every year, and they stand as a community and they remember God's deliverance of their people, and they read it in its entirety. But it's an interesting book. It's a controversial book. There's no mention of God's name. Some in history wanted the book called Mordecai. They said, oh, Esther's not really the hero here, it's Mordecai. Martin Luther, he didn't like the book. He tossed it into the river Elbe. He thought it was full of heathen naughtiness. And if you say that in church today, most people go home to read it. Others thought it a complete fabrication, and others called it Arabian Night Tale. But for us as just evangelical Christians, we believe the story is true. We believe it has just meaning for us today, that God has breathed his Spirit through that story. And as you look at it, you see many coincidences. And although God is unseen, he is not absent. For us, it is a very important book because it reveals how God, even though unseen, is at work using all our actions and decisions for his greater plans. So just a quick reminder of the story, and then I've just got 3 short points. But God's covenant people are living in exile. The temple was far away, and the question on everyone's heart was, has God forgotten us? And the powerful king, he throws a banquet to display his wealth. He wants to boast about Queen Vashti and her beauty, and she refuses to come in before the king and his drunken friends. And Vashti is banished and a new queen is sought. And Esther wins a beauty pageant, and Mordecai, her older cousin, instructs Esther to keep her identity hidden. And Haman, who is related to the Amalekites, is promoted. And through history, they had wanted to annihilate the Jews. And Haman comes in and he seizes this opportunity and he despises Mordecai. But he sends Esther a message, and this is the most well-known verse in the book of Esther. And Mordecai says this, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." And so there was this rebuke, but there was also this choice for Esther to get involved. And we know that the story finishes with Haman being hanged and the Jews throughout the kingdom being saved. And it's a story of reversals. But chapter 4 that we read together as a community is the turning point in the story. Up until this point, Esther is just this young, beautiful girl who was just this pawn, and she just moved around. But Mordecai suggests to her that there was an overarching story, that Esther was part of a bigger story, that there was a higher plan, and that she was there to save her people from genocide. And after this rebuke, Esther aligns herself with her people, and the whole story changes direction. She becomes the initiator. She starts making the plans, and she gives direction and a command to her older cousin. But it was when Esther aligned herself with God's covenant people that she found her dignity and her position in life. And this is the message today, is I just wonder, what is it that God has aligned you to? Maybe you've already found that. But so often our lives are directionless because we don't know where we're going. And for Esther, she aligned herself with God's people. She could have easily lived a life of compromise, as she had already been in the palace for a number of years. She could have just said to Mordecai, well, I'll be praying for you. Good luck there. But the author, when he wrote this book, he begins to refer to Queen Esther after chapter 4. And every time, not every time, but most of the time, he refers to her as queen. She'd become queen before that. But before chapter 4, he just refers to Esther. But it was like when she aligned herself, that's when she took on her true identity. Esther assumes the dignity and power of her royal position only after she claims her true identity as a woman of God. And so 3 just short points about her life. What was the result of her alignment with God's people? And the first one that we note from this story is that Esther understood the bigger picture of how her life fitted into God's purposes. She would have understood the coincidences or the God incidences. She would have understood that God's hand was at work, just placing her in the palace. She would have understood that her privileged position in the royal court as Queen Esther wasn't just because of her beauty. And she would have come to the realization that the director of world affairs had placed her in position for such a time as this. And the favor that she won was from a divine source. As you look at the Hebrew word used, it wasn't just given to her. She was able to extract it from the king, from the chief eunuch in the harem. And her position was secondary to the main calling on her life, which was to be an intercessor for her people. And as you look at chapter 2, verses 8 to 11, 15 to 17, and again in chapter 5, verses 2 and 8, you see the word favor just pops up a number of times. And I just wonder for you and for me today, where has God placed you? Where do you sense that divine favor? I was working as a quantity surveyor in West Perth when I felt a calling into mission. I was just dreading this, and I was just going, grew up in India, parents were missionaries, really didn't want this life of poverty and going with that. I just thought, oh no. But somehow God just changed my heart and mind. And so I said, okay, well, I'll go for 2 years. And I just remember going in to see my boss. I'd just been through 4 years of training. And I went in and I knocked on the door because I had to tell him I was resigning and I was dreading. And my parents, every day I went home, said, hey, have you told your boss yet that you're leaving? I said, oh, no. I'm just waiting for the right moment. They said, Lord, this is so disrespectful. You have to tell him. And finally I went in to see him and I knocked on the door. And he looked up, and I could tell straight away that he knew that I was coming in to give him bad news. And I think it was bad news. And he just looks up and he goes, well, what can I do? I said, look, such and such, you know that I'm a Christian. He said, yes. I said, look, I just feel that I would like to go to Russia and serve in a mission situation. And he goes, Lloyd, you have to go. This is a calling on your life. This is a non-Christian. And I was expecting him to say, no, you can't go. And I go, okay, well, I can't go then. Well, And he said, no, this is a calling on your life. What can I do to help you? And they gave me so much finance when I left. They offered me my job back a few years later. They offered my wife a job also when we came back after a few years. And some of those people still support us to this day. And as non-Christians, they did more for me than the church that sent me out in the very beginning. But when I look at your relationship to Sally and to others that you've sent out, it's very, very special. But I just wonder for you, where is it that you find favor? Maybe it's just in your family. Maybe it's at your workplace, in your extended family. What is our unique place? Where has God led us? Can we see divine fingerprints? Who are your neighbors? Where are we experiencing God's favor? And I just wanted to read something out from a report of 1,000 people in Australia that were interviewed by the McCrindle Foundation. And so they interviewed 1,000 people about religion in Australia. So religion in Australia is not dead, they report. The study shows that 2/3 of Australians, 68% currently follow a religion or have spiritual beliefs. That's 2 out of 3. The number of Australians who do not identify with a religion or spiritual belief, however, is on the rise. Just going quickly, more than half of Australians are open to some extent to changing their religious views given the right circumstances and evidence, which I think is really quite remarkable. And the greatest attraction to investigating spirituality and religion is observing people who live out a genuine faith. Second is experiencing a personal trauma or significant life change. And that's why it's so important for us to be aware of what is happening in the lives of people around us. Now get this, the top propellant to investigating religion and spirituality for many people in Australia is hearing from public figures and celebrities who are examples of that faith. This is followed by miraculous stories of people being healed or supernatural occurrences. And you just wonder, oh gosh, what's going on? And so you need to put some thought into that. There are also spaces in society that are perceived to be more appropriate than others when talking about spirituality and religion. The 2 most inappropriate places are suggested to be shopping centres, deemed as very inappropriate, and then community events or groups. And so just have a think about how you share your faith. And so the reason I read that out is because we need to think about the places where God has positioned us. Where is it that you are finding favor and are able to share your faith with other people? Secondly, Esther's alignment with God's covenant people gave her direction and passion. It gave her energy and courage and a reason to live. And as you go into the remainder of this year is just flying past. I just wonder, do you have courage? You're looking forward to Monday morning. Do you have energy? Do you know where you're going? And if you don't, I just wonder, are you correctly aligned? It doesn't mean that there's not going to be hardship, but do you know what you're aligned with? Because Esther became a leader overnight. Instead of Mordecai, her older cousin, giving instruction, it became Esther. And Esther became the policy maker. And in these verses, we see that Esther's decision gave her courage. She enters the inner court. You weren't allowed to do that. Anyone who did that could be banished or sentenced to death. She uses her brain. She's clever. She starts positioning the king. She positions Haman, and she sets up his downfall. And so I just wonder for you as you go into this week, do you have energy? Do you have that courage? Are you properly aligned? And then Esther's alignment gave her hope, despite the consequences. There was just no guarantee of her safety. And she said to Mordecai, I will just go into the palace, into the inner chamber. If I perish, I perish. But she understood there was an overarching story and that she had to do what she could. She knew that God would use her as part of his plan, but she also knew that it might mean that she gave her life. She had hope despite the personal consequences of her decision. And faith allows our lives to have a different ending to that which we hope for and to that which we pray for. And just in closing, just the application for us, because I'm always concerned about Monday and where you're going and where Monday morning, where you'll find yourself, is that when we align ourselves with God and his purposes, our lives take on much greater significance. We gain understanding about the purpose of life. It gives us direction and passion, and it gives us a hope for the future. Esther was transported into a world that she didn't want to be in, but she was faithful and she served God where she was. The story of Esther, the author doesn't comment on that internal dialogue, whether she was fearful, whether she was lonely, but she just went in and she served. She served in the situation where she was placed, but like Daniel, just transported into a world that was foreign, powers beyond her control. But we too in the daily grind can lay a platform for the future. But we too can find ourselves in a second choice world where circumstances are beyond our control, where life can just overtake us. And when I mean a second choice world, sometimes we live in a world where others have made decisions and we end up in their world. Sometimes it can be economics, it can be made redundant. People make poor financial decisions, or a spouse walks out, or something happens. And there's illness. But here we have a picture of Esther in a second choice world. We have the example of Daniel. But we have Esther just serving faithfully, just being a good witness. And we are vulnerable sometimes, but we are not helpless. And God is able to work through the pressures that we face and bring about a reversal of fortune. And sometimes God's hand is invisible, but it is not to be interpreted as God being absent. God is at work in our lives, through us, and in our circumstances. And sometimes we just have to take that time just to look for those divine fingerprints.